So thank you so much. It's an incredible pleasure and honor to be here in Munich and to give this lecture. I've thoroughly enjoyed the past couple of days that I've spent here at SIFO attending the conference and to meet many new people and see old friends. It's particularly an honor to give the Musgrave lecture because every day when I walk to my office at Harvard, I walk by the photo of Richard Musgrave, and so I kind of see that as an inspiration and something to aspire for in my own career, to emulate the great work that he did. And so I also want to thank both Mike and Hans Werner for their very kind and generous introductions. I've learned a lot from their work over the years. And I also want to emphasize for many others here and elsewhere who have been my collaborators, students, research assistants, all who have contributed greatly to my work and to the work that I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to speak today about behavioral economics and public policy. And just to give you a little bit of the backstory for how I got to this talk and this paper. So Dick Thaler, who was the president of the AEA last year, asked me to give the Richard T. Ely Lecturer at the AEA meeting, and he asked me to speak about behavioral economics. And I was somewhat surprised because I typically don't think of myself as a behavioral economist. And so the perspective that Dick wanted me to give and that I ultimately tried to put together is one of a practitioner who's interested in behavioral economics from the perspective of answering public policy questions rather than per se as a field in and of itself. And so that's the type of work that I'll talk about today. So let me start with just a simple definition. What is behavioral economics? And in my view, one way to think about behavioral economics is that it brings insights from psychology and other social sciences into economic models. So think about things like loss aversion or present bias, mental accounting, inattention, and the list goes on in terms of the types of phenomena psychologists have documented and economists have tried to introduce into economic models. Now, as we all know, behavioral economics has grown very rapidly as a subfield, but I think most of us would agree that the neoclassical model remains the benchmark in most applications, and normally we'd start with the neoclassical model when thinking about most of the problems that we work on. Now, the debate about behavioral economics, sometimes quite controversial, is often framed as a question about the foundational assumptions of economic models. So in particular, are people rational? Do they optimize in market settings? And I think a fair reading of this literature is that there are compelling arguments on both sides of this debate in different settings. So I think there's some good work showing that phenomena that you might initially have thought are inconsistent with rational models can actually be explained when you think about the problem in a broader way. And there are other examples where there's quite compelling evidence that people don't seem to be optimizing as you would have predicted based on standard theories. So I'm instead going to approach the debate from a different perspective here, from what I'm going to call a pragmatic perspective. Instead of defining the central research question as are the assumptions of the neoclassical model valid or not, that is, instead of putting behavioral economics in opposition with neoclassical economics, I'm going to think about the problem just starting from a practical policy question. So for instance, take a question that policymakers spend a lot of time thinking about: how can we increase savings rates? And what I want to do here is use behavioral economics to the extent that it helps us make better empirical predictions in answering questions like these, and ultimately improve policy decisions. Now, some of you will recognize that this approach follows the widely applied methodology of positive economics that was articulated by Milton Friedman in a famous article in 1953. And Friedman used this reasoning of positive economics, that is, develop models that help explain the data, to argue in favor of neoclassical rational economic models. And I'm going to argue that a modern reading of the data, following the same line of thought, instead favors bringing in at least some of the ideas from behavioral economics. So what I want to suggest here is that we should treat behavioral factors like any other modeling decision that you might make. For example, do you assume that utility is time separable or not? Or do you assume a quasi-linear utility function? Or assume some other functional form what I'll try to argue is that thinking about behavioral economics in the same way can be very productive. So from a pragmatic perspective, my view is that behavioral economics can make three types of contributions to public policy. The first is that it allows us to identify new policy tools. So for instance, the use of defaults to increase the amount that people save for retirement, or changing the way in which choices are framed as a way to influence behavior. The second is that it can offer better predictions of the effects of existing policies. So for instance, existing policy tools like changes in tax rates. I'll argue that we might be able to better predict the impacts of these policies by incorporating insights from behavioral economics. Now, those first two implications are purely positive. In some ways, I think the most challenging issues arise when you think about the welfare implications of behavioral models, exactly as Hans Werner emphasized in his introduction. How do you think about optimal policy, and how do you think about the welfare implications of policy changes in a non-paternalistic manner when you allow for the possibility that people might not be optimizing on their behalf? So I'll, in this talk, illustrate these ideas using three applications which focus on major decisions that people make over their lives: how much to save, how much to work, and where to live. In the paper, which will be published in the next issue of the AER and the May issue of the American Economic Review, I give several other examples of these three types of implications of behavioral economics, and there are a number of other surveys that cover a broad array of other examples as well. So let me start with the first question and the first application, which is illustration of new policy tools to increase retirement saving. So there's growing concern, as you all know, that many people might not be saving adequately for retirement. So in the United States, for example, we spend about $100 billion per year on subsidies for retirement savings accounts such as 401ks and IRAs. Now, is this the best way to achieve policymakers' goal of increasing household savings rates? So in a recent paper, my collaborators and I studied this question using administrative wealth data for all Danish households. And we begin by simply analyzing the effects of a reduction in the subsidy for retirement accounts that are similar to individual retirement accounts in the US in 1999. So look at a change in the conventional policy instrument used to stimulate retirement savings, which are subsidies for retirement savings accounts. So let me turn to the data and show you what that evidence looks like. So what we do here is use a very simple quasi-experimental design where we're looking at this tax policy change in 1999. And the way this worked is that households who were above 250,000 Danish kroner in terms of their household income, that translates to an income of roughly 40,000 US dollars or so. These households up here, they faced a change in the retirement subsidy that they received for contributing to retirement accounts after 1999. That subsidy was reduced by about 12 cents per dollar after 1999 relative to before 1999. The people below 250K, they didn't have any change in their retirement subsidy pre versus post. So we're going to think of the people on the left of that dashed line as a control group and the people on the right side as a treatment group whose incentives changed. So what I'm plotting here are pension contributions in 5,000 kroner bins, so mean pension contributions in 5,000 kroner bins, first in this series for 1996. And you see a smooth upward sloping relationship. As you might expect, richer people also contribute more to their retirement accounts, they save more. So now let's look at the evolution of this series over time. This is how it looks in 1997, 1998, and you can see it stays relatively stable. Now in 99, as soon as the subsidy is reduced for households in the top income tax bracket above 250,000, you see that retirement account contributions immediately fall sharply, exactly as you'd expect, and they continue to stay lower in 2000 and in 2001. So when you look at that data, and you can see quite clearly in the control group, there's hardly any change at all, looks fairly clear that cutting the subsidy for retirement savings accounts appears to substantially reduce the amount that people contribute to such accounts. And so at first blush, when you just look at this data, this A lines up perfectly well with the neoclassical model. You reduce the price of some activity, you see that people are doing more of it, or in this case, you're increasing the price of contributing to retirement accounts, and people are contributing less. But when you dig deeper, I would argue the data don't look quite as consistent with the standard life cycle model of savings in the way that you might have expected. So it turns out that the aggregate reduction that I just showed you is driven by about 19% of treated households who completely stopped contributing to these retirement accounts. The remaining 80% or so of people, if you look at the data at the micro level instead of adding everyone up, you find that 80% of people did nothing at all to their retirement account contributions. They just completely ignored this change in the subsidy. So naturally, if you're thinking about an optimizing model of behavior, if people are at an interior optimum, when the price of a good changes, everyone should re-optimize by at least a little bit. So the fact that 80% make literally no change at all instead points to, I think, a model where most individuals are inattentive, or they face some fixed cost of adjustment, or there's some sort of bounded rationality type of behavior in terms of how they make these retirement savings decisions. Now, moreover, we find that 90% of this reduction in retirement contributions that I just showed you is offset by more saving in non-retirement accounts. So that is, there's substantial crowd out here. So you take $1,000 out of your retirement account, but you put $900 back in a taxable savings account. So if you care about total savings, which is what presumably we should be interested in, you're not having all that much of an impact on aggregate savings with these subsidies. In fact, we end up concluding that each dollar of marginal expenditure on tax subsidies raises total personal saving by only about 1 cent. So this doesn't seem like a particularly effective way to raise retirement savings. So that naturally leads to the next question of whether there are more effective policies to raise retirement saving. So motivated by the fact that it seems like a large fraction of people are quite inattentive in how they make these decisions, one naturally thinks of other policy tools that might essentially exploit that inattention in order to try to raise retirement savings. And so here I'm going to talk about defaults and automatic enrollment. So there's very influential work done by Bridget Madrin and Dennis Shea, as well as David Laibson, Andrew Metrick, and various co-authors, that shows that switching to an opt-out system increases participation rates in retirement plans from 20 to 80% at the point of hire. So in other words, when you start to work at a firm, we give you exactly the same retirement plan as you had before, but we just make a very simple change. Instead of signing a form saying that you want to join the retirement plan, you now have to sign a form saying you don't want to be in the retirement plan. So that is, you have to opt out instead of opt in. That simple change, which doesn't change your economic incentives at all, changes the fraction of people contributing to these plans from 20% to 80%. Now, while that finding is extremely important, there was still an important open question remaining in this literature, which is whether these defaults raise total saving or whether they also just lead people to shift assets. So you might think, intuitively, I default you into saving more in this one account, but a very natural response might just be to say, I'm going to consume exactly the same as what I was consuming before, and that's going to end up with me having a smaller bank balance at the end of the year, and my total saving will remain unchanged. So again, one wants to look at whether total savings are being affected by these policies. So here again, we turn to the Danish data, and it's an example of what Mike was talking about in terms of data availability really transforming our ability to answer these kinds of questions. And so here, we're tracking savings around job changes, exploiting variation in employers' retirement plans. So in Denmark, like in the US, employers and individuals contribute to the same or similar accounts. And as a result, employer contributions to retirement accounts are a perfect substitute for individual savings. So essentially the question we're going to ask is, if your employer starts to contribute more to your retirement savings account on your behalf, do you offset that as would be predicted in a standard life cycle model? Or do you just end up raising the total amount that you save? So in order to study that, we're going to use an event study design looking at people who switch firms. So in this graph, we're looking at a set of people who switched from one firm to another in the Danish economy, and year 0 is the year in which they switched firms. And I'm going to focus here on the subset of people who switch to a firm that's contributing 3% more to their retirement account than their prior firm. Okay, so this is a set of people who happen to take a job at a firm that's contributing much more to their retirement account than their previous firm. So the first series here plots employer pension contributions. And this is mechanical. Because we've selected a set of people who are switching to firms that contribute a lot more, we see that there's a big jump in employer pensions right at the point that they switch to this new firm. Now, what I want to turn to is how that affects the individual's saving behavior. So remember that in the neoclassical model, because the individual's budget set has not changed and no prices have changed, we would expect to see that the individual would perfectly offset this increase in the green series in terms of their own savings. So this now shows you individual pension contributions to the exact same retirement accounts. And you can see that qualitatively that prediction is borne out. In fact, the red series does fall when the green series jumps up. But that fall is quite small in magnitude. It's only about 1/10 or 15% as large as the increase in employer pension contributions. Now, moreover, in the Danish data, you can look not just at retirement account contributions, but you can look at saving in all other taxable accounts as well. So you have data on what people have in their bank accounts, brokerage accounts, et cetera, et cetera. You can add that all up, and that also just looks completely flat. So you add these three series together, and what you end up concluding is that, in fact, when your employer raises his retirement account contributions by $1, total savings of the individual seem to go up by about 85 cents. Or put differently, approximately 85% of individuals respond passively to changes in employer contributions and increase total savings. Moreover, these savings increases persist for more than a decade, and ultimately we're able to see in the data that they lead to greater wealth at the point of retirement. So this is not just like a transitory thing where you don't notice it and you later undo it. You look at people 10, 15 years later and you see that they have a substantially different wealth position just because of the plan they got defaulted into. So what we end up concluding from this analysis is that defaults appear to be a much more effective way to increase savings rates rather than changes in tax subsidies. Now, that simple lesson has had some impact in the US policy discussion as the government is looking for ways to basically reduce tax expenditures and increase revenue. And so one idea that's being discussed is to cap the deduction on retirement savings accounts so that you can't fully deduct it from your income tax bill, and instead start to shift towards automatic enrollment plans where the government automatically puts 1% of your paycheck in an individual retirement account or something like that. So the broader lesson, now coming back to the theme of this talk, is that defaults make it feasible to achieve outcomes that could not be achieved with the existing policy tools that we were discussing, namely changes in subsidies or tax rates. So it just simply expands the set of outcomes that we can achieve. And so from a positive perspective, that has some value. In fact, I would argue if you have an exogenous policy objective of increasing saving, so suppose the policymaker comes to you and says, for whatever reason, I've decided we want to increase savings rates, then it's useful to know that this instrument might actually be a much more effective way to achieve that goal than changes in subsidies, even if the underlying assumptions of the behavioral model remain debated, even if we're not totally sure why defaults matter. Is it bounded rationality, or is it inattention, or is it something else? I would argue for answering that question of how do you raise savings rates, it might not actually be critical to know exactly what the underlying theory is. However, I want to emphasize that that doesn't mean that there's no value to better understanding the theory. I actually think that that's quite critical for two reasons. So the first is extrapolation. So if you want to predict the effect of policies in other contexts, you implicitly or explicitly need some theory, right? So if you literally had no theory, then you would have no way of knowing if this evidence from the Danish data applies in the US, right? Like Danish people are happier than Americans and taller than Americans. Who knows if they are maybe more, they would respond differently to retirement savings incentives relative to people in other countries. Now, if you actually had some at least implicit theory of what's going on, that you think people are inattentive, you could start to investigate whether the degree of inattention is similar in different settings, and then make predictions about what type of behavioral responses you would see in different economies. So that's one from a positive point of view. The second, which I'll come back to later in the talk, is welfare analysis. So should we be trying to get people to save more? Sometimes I think policymakers just take that as an objective they want to achieve, take it as given. And maybe it's reasonable to think intuitively that people should be saving more for retirement so that they're prepared for retirement. But I think you can come up with equally good examples of cases where you might not want to force somebody to save more. So for example, take a person who's just had a negative income shock, who just lost his job or something like that, or who needs money to pay for his kid's college education. You probably don't want to be forcing that person to save more, at least at that point in time. So I think there are important questions of what the optimal savings rate is, what the optimal default is, and those can only be answered if you have a better theoretical understanding of what's going on. So I'll come back to the welfare analysis issues in a little bit more detail later on. So let me now turn to second application, which illustrates a different set of issues, a different way in which I think behavioral economics can be useful for public economists. And this is making better predictions, and here I'm going to focus on the effects of income taxation. So even if one does not have new policy instruments, I think behavioral models can still be quite useful in predicting the impacts of existing policies. And I'm going to illustrate that here by characterizing the effects of the earned income tax credit on labor supply decisions. So in the US, the federal government spends about $60 billion a year on the earned income tax credit. It's the largest cash transfer anti-poverty program in the US now. And the way the EITC works is very simple. It provides a 40% subsidy for earnings up to an income of about $12,600. And that exact number varies with the number of kids. And then the EITC amount is reduced as income rises further. So there's a subsidy for wages at low levels, and then at some point, that subsidy is reduced as you earn more and more. This program was expanded to its current form in 1996 under the Clinton administration as part of an effort to increase the return to working for low-income families. And I understand that similar reforms have been recently made in Germany. So it's analogous to that type of change. So the question we're asking here is, how has the EITC affected the earnings behavior of low-income families? So one of the key goals of this program is that we're trying to give low-income families more of an incentive to work. And so has it been successful in increasing the amount of work among low-income families and increasing their earnings through behavioral responses? So in the study that I'm going to describe next, we used de-identified federal income tax returns covering the US population from 1996 to 2009. And that data set covers 78 million taxpayers for whom we have 1.1 billion observations on income in the slides that I'll be showing you. So our initial research plan, again, showing you that the origin of this idea had nothing to do with behavioral economics at all. Our initial research plan was to exploit differences in state-level EITC top-up policies. So it turns out some states offer more generous earned income tax credits than others, and we thought, okay, we'll compare, like Wisconsin, which has very generous EITC, with Illinois, and see how things changed when they expanded their EITC and so forth. And so we started out by examining how income distributions vary across states in the US. So let me show you some pictures just to show you what we saw initially. So this is the distribution of taxable income in the state of Texas in the US. And this is just a simple histogram, right? It's the fraction of people reporting income in each bin. Now, 12,600 is the refund maximizing point of the US income distribution. So that's, if you report an income of 12,600, you get a check of about $4,500 or so in the mail from the government. So you can see that a bunch of people have figured that out. And there's a big spike in the income distribution exactly at the refund maximizing point where people are reporting an income that's going to exactly generate the biggest refund. So this is what the distribution looks like in Texas. So now let's look at the distribution in another state, nearby state, Kansas. The the amount of bunching at the refund maximizing threshold in Kansas is dramatically smaller than in Texas. So you might initially have thought, oh, maybe that's because Kansas has a different policy than Texas, but that's actually not true. There's no difference in EITC policies between these two states, yet Texas has much more bunching than Kansas at the refund maximizing kink. So seeing this evidence, we decided to look into this further at a more granular level, and we computed the fraction of individuals who are exactly at this refund maximizing kink among EITC claimants. So call that the sharp bunching rate, and we computed that for every zip code in the US. That's the power of having data on the full population. And we put that on a heat map, okay? So the way this map is constructed is darker areas are areas where a larger fraction of people are reporting income exactly at the refund maximizing kink. And this first map that I'm showing you here is drawn using data in 1996 when the program was really expanded to its current form. So when you look at this map in 1996, most of the country looks pretty light. That is, the amount of bunching is relatively low, with a few exceptions. So for example, look at the southern tip of Texas here, which is much darker than the rest of the US. So now let's look at what happens to sharp EITC bunching over time. This is how it looks in 1999, 2002, 2005, 2008. So you can see that it kind of looks like this behavior emanates from the southern tip of Texas and diffuses through the rest of the United States, right? So those patterns, as we started to look into them, they naturally lead you away from thinking about the simple setup we were thinking about of comparing across states and relating that to EITC policy changes. We started to think more about what is driving this great deal of local area variation in responses to what is essentially a federal policy. So why does the impact of the EITC on income vary so much across areas? So one plausible behavioral model is that there are differences in knowledge about the EITC. So traditionally in public finance, we typically assume that people optimize perfectly with respect to the tax code and are fully informed about the tax incentives that they face. But it's plausible, especially in a very low income population, it's a very low education population, that people might not be fully aware of how the EITC works and so on. So in order to understand whether differences in knowledge might explain why there are these differences in behavioral responses to the EITC, we look at individuals who move across areas. So in particular, when you look at people who move, the model of knowledge and learning makes a very specific prediction. It predicts that moving to a higher bunching area, for instance, moving from Kansas to Texas, should increase your EITC refund or increase your degree of responsiveness to the program. But if you move from Texas to Kansas, as long as you have memory, you should continue to respond even after you move, right? And so that's exactly what we look for in the data, and remarkably, you find exactly that pattern. So let me describe this chart to you here. So on the x-axis here is the change in the sharp bunching rate among the prior residents living in each zip code. So the points on the far right here are people who are moving, for example, from Kansas to Texas. They're moving to a place where the prior residents are much more responsive. And the people on the left are moving to places that are much less responsive than where they lived before. So what we're plotting is the change in the EITC refund amount. So basically a measure of how concentrated the income distribution is around $12,600. We're plotting the change in the refund amount after the move relative to before the move. So you can see that the people who are moving to places like Texas, when they get there, they start to claim much larger EITC refunds. That is, they report income much closer to $12,600. But the people who move to lower bunching areas, you don't see any change at all in their refund amounts. So that is exactly what you would have predicted if this is about knowledge and learning, right? That the moves down have no effect, but the moves up change your behavior. And we think it's less likely that other explanations for the spatial variation ex ante would have generated exactly this asymmetric pattern that you would have predicted from knowledge and learning. Now, this sharp bunching that I've been focusing on at the refund maximizing kink is driven primarily by self-employed individuals who manipulate reported income. So self-employment income, as you all know, is self-reported to the tax authority. And so it makes it much easier to manipulate self-employment income in order to get the biggest refund you can than it is to manipulate other sources of income which are directly reported to the tax authority by your employer, for instance. So essentially, what we've been focusing on so far is the fact that these tax incentives affect the reported income of taxpayers. But ultimately, the goal of the EITC was not just to get people to write down a different number on the tax forms that they submit, it's to actually get them to work more, right? And so the deeper question is how the earned income tax credit affects real labor supply behavior. And so in order to study this, in the next set of slides I'm going to show you, we analyze the impacts on wage earnings excluding self-employment income. So the idea here is that wage earnings, like my salary at Harvard, are directly reported to the IRS. And so there's little scope for misreporting because it's immediately cross-validated. It would be very difficult for me to misstate my salary, right? And so we're going to start by examining the distribution of wage earnings in the US as a whole. So let me start with this chart here, which shows you in the US population the income distribution for single wage earners with one child. So one of the groups that's affected by the EITC, single people who have one child. It's showing you the wage, the earnings distribution, just the pure wage earnings distribution. So two things to note here. First, notice that you see no sharp spike at the refund maximizing level of the EITC. So this is the EITC schedule shown in the background here. So the way it works is there's a subsidy, then there's a plateau region, and then the subsidy is phased out. This point here is the point that maximizes your refund. The reason for that is you continue to pay other taxes, payroll taxes, for example, as you have higher and higher levels of income. So the place at which you get the biggest refund is the beginning of the plateau. So for the self-employed, we saw this big spike, at least in certain states like Texas, at that point. But for the wage earners, you see the distribution looks totally smooth. So if you just look at that distribution, you might say, oh, it looks like the wage earners are not responding, at least not in that very sharp way. But if you think about it further, it's probably implausible that the wage earners could perfectly target a given income level, right? So if you're a typical person here, say, is working at Walmart, it's going to be very hard to tell Walmart, I want to have an income of exactly $12,600. Can you give me a shift so that I get exactly to that level, right? So it's implausible that you see such a sharp response. So the question we're after here is whether the EITC is having an effect on this distribution. There's a lot of empirical work by labor economists and public economists trying to tackle this question, and it's a very difficult question to answer because we tend not to have good counterfactuals for these types of federal policies. We basically want to know what this distribution would have looked like in the absence of the EITC, right? So what I want to show you now is how the behavioral model of the knowledge model can be very useful in that respect. So as I've said, the effects of the EITC on real wage earnings are too diffuse to detect without a counterfactual, but what I'm going to show is that the knowledge model can be very useful in producing such a counterfactual. So essentially our idea is very simple. We're going to use low information areas as a counterfactual for what the earnings distribution would have looked like in the absence of the EITC. The idea is simply that if you have no knowledge about a program, no knowledge about tax incentives, then you can't possibly be responding to the program. So the idea is that we can use places like Kansas, maybe where people don't know very much about the EITC. They don't seem to be responding in terms of that sharp bunching measure as a counterfactual for what earnings would have looked like in the absence of the program. So what we're going to do here is proxy for information using the level of sharp bunching in an area. Essentially, what I was showing you before is that the degree of sharp bunching among the self-employed seems to be driven by differences in knowledge. And so, ideally, we would have gone and figured out the knowledge about EITC in every part of the US, lacking that data. We're going to use the degree of self-employed sharp bunching as a proxy for the amount of knowledge in that area. And so before I turn to show you what this evidence looks like, let me just stress what I think the broader lesson is here, which is that behavioral models, I think, can be very usefully employed in order to generate counterfactuals to estimate policy impacts. So even if you're not per se interested in behavioral factors, you just want to understand from a neoclassical point of view how a given tax policy affects earnings responses. Bringing in behavioral economics can be useful in providing a counterfactual in a way that you would not otherwise have had. So, another example of this, for instance, is there's good evidence that there's inertia in health plan choice. So people tend to stick with the health plan that they originally had when they signed up in the US, where you have private health insurance at the company where they started working. And so exploiting that inertia, you essentially get variation in the types of health policies that different people have, which gives you counterfactuals to analyze the impacts of health insurance on healthcare utilization and health behavior and so on. Okay, so let's come back to the EITC. Come to this question of, is the EITC having an effect on this earnings distribution? And what I'm going to do is split this earnings distribution into two groups: places that are low information, so in the blue, places like Kansas, and in the red, places like Texas, which appear to have a lot more knowledge about the EITC. And so what do you see here? You see that the red distribution, the places where people have more knowledge, there's more mass diffusely around the refund maximizing region of the EITC. So at a broad level, what would we expect in a neoclassical labor supply model? We would expect people to want to earn in this region where they get the biggest refund, right? Because they face a very high tax here and they have a big subsidy here. And that's exactly what you see if you look at the high knowledge areas relative to the low knowledge areas. It's exactly consistent with what you would have predicted. The idea is sort of the blue gives you a picture of what the earnings distribution would have looked like had we not had the program. And the red tells you how people respond when they're actually aware of the program. And so it does in fact look like the program has a significant effect on the amount that people are earning. Now, these simple comparisons across areas, which is what I've been showing you so far, could well be biased by omitted variables. So you might worry, for instance, that the industrial structure in Texas is different from Kansas. I mean, there are numerous differences across these states, right? So you don't want to rely just purely on a cross-sectional comparison. So we're able to do a simple variant of this design to deal with that problem, which is that we study changes in earnings around childbirth in order to address that concern. So individuals without children are essentially ineligible for the EITC in the US. You pretty much only get the EITC if you have a kid. As a result, the birth of a child generates very sharp variation in your marginal incentives. You have a big subsidy for earning more once you have a child relative to when you don't have a child. Now, if you just were to use this change directly, that would be kind of a crazy experiment to think about, right? Because essentially we're comparing labor supply behavior after having a child relative to before having a child, and presumably there are many other reasons you might change the amount you work besides tax incentives when you have a kid. So again, we're going to rely on the differences in information to provide a counterfactual here. And we're going to compare between low and high information areas. So this here shows you the earnings distribution in the year before a child is born in areas with low levels of information and the highest levels of information. And what I want you to see here is that these two distributions look quite well aligned before kids are born. Now you look at the year right after the child is born, and you immediately see that there's more mass in the earnings distribution exactly in the refund maximizing range of the earned income tax credit relative to the low information areas. So it's perfectly consistent with the view that basically if you're living in an area where people seem to be well informed about the EITC, you are more likely to continue working or stay in part-time work so that you maintain an income around $12,000 rather than dropping out of the labor force or cutting back on the amount that you earn. So further analysis along these lines reveals that the EITC primarily induces increases in earnings in the phase-in region where you're providing the subsidy, rather than reductions in earnings in the phase-out region. So we end up concluding from this that the program is actually quite effective in increasing the amount that people work, especially in areas where people are well aware of the EITC. Now, what's the characteristic of those areas? The single dominant characteristic is that they are areas with a very large density of EITC claimants. So that's consistent with an agglomeration model of knowledge diffusion, where basically if you're living in an apartment building where lots of other people claim the EITC and know about the EITC, then when you have a child, your neighbor tells you, oh, you should continue to try to keep your job because you're going to get this big refund from the government. If you're eligible for the same program, but you're in an area where nobody around you is aware of the program, you're much less likely to know about it and respond to it. That essentially seems to be the pattern we see in the data. What's the broader lesson here for behavioral economics and public policy? I think this type of work shows that incorporating behavioral features into the model helps us better predict the impacts of the policies we've been interested in studying for a very long period of time. Okay, so let me now turn to the third and final application, which is on welfare analysis. So until now, we've been focused on purely positive issues, so essentially purely empirical issues at some level, predicting policy impacts. But behavioral models can also lead to new normative implications, that is, new prescriptions for optimal policy. Now, the key challenge here is how we characterize these normative implications in a non-paternalistic manner that is adhering to some of the fundamental principles of economics, of public economics in particular. So I'm going to illustrate these issues by focusing on a different application related to our most recent work in our research group, which is focused on neighborhood effects. I'm going to talk about neighborhood effects and housing voucher policies. So I'm going to start by summarizing a set of empirical results on neighborhood effects. So the first point I want to make, just to set the stage here with the empirical background before turning to the welfare analysis, is that children's outcomes vary significantly across neighborhoods, conditional on parent income. So we've been doing quite a bit of work recently on intergenerational mobility and equality of opportunity and how it has changed in the US and how it compares to other countries. And one of the key findings from that work is that there's a great deal of variation in social mobility across areas of the US. So let me illustrate that with this map here, which shows you the geography of intergenerational mobility in the United States. And I'm using a very simple statistic to measure the degree of intergenerational mobility, which is the probability that a child who is born to parents in the bottom quintile of the US income distribution makes the leap all the way to the top quintile of the US income distribution. So what fraction of kids who start out in the bottom 20% reach the top 20%? Now, this is again a heat map where lighter areas are areas with higher levels of social mobility. So in the lightest colored areas, for instance, in the middle of the US, the Great Plains, the probability of reaching the top 20% of the national income distribution, conditional on starting in the bottom 20%, exceeds 16.8%. In the darkest red areas, the probability of rising from the bottom fifth to the top fifth is less than 4.8%. Now, this spectrum of variation is actually larger than the variation that we see across countries. So, for example, countries like Denmark or Canada, which have some of the highest rates of social mobility in the world, you see numbers like 13% or 14% for a comparable statistic. The places like Atlanta, Georgia, have lower rates of upward mobility than any developed country for which we currently have data. Now, these are really big differences. So sometimes when they initially see these numbers, they react by saying, oh, even in like San Jose or Salt Lake City, you only have a 13% chance of success, right, of rising from the bottom to the top. Now, of course, you have to remember that no matter what you do, you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%, right? So there's essentially a ceiling on what this number can be of 20% in a society where your parents are completely irrelevant for your outcomes. You'd get a number of 20%. So these are actually quite large differences in mobility across areas. Turns out in work we're doing currently, there's even substantial variation at a much more local level. So this is now showing you the geography of mobility in the Boston metropolitan area, dividing the Boston area into counties. And so Suffolk County here is the city of Boston, and Middlesex County here is Cambridge, where Harvard and MIT are across the river. And what you can see here is if you're growing up in Suffolk County, you have an 8.2% chance of rising from the bottom to top. But if you cross the river to Cambridge or Somerville, other nearby areas, you have a 14% chance. The kids who are growing up there, 14% of them rise from the bottom to the top. So it's like very narrow geography. There's a tremendous amount of variation in your odds of moving up in the income distribution. So that's fact number one, lots of spatial variation in upward mobility across areas. Now, critically, in two papers that we're going to release later this month, we show that these differences are primarily due to the causal effects of place. So it's not that the people who are living in San Jose are different from the people living in Atlanta. That's part of it, but that's not all of it, because it turns out if you take a given child and essentially think about the experiment of putting that given child in a different area, you see that any given child's probabilities of succeeding vary greatly depending upon where he grows up. And so we basically tackle that question. We show that this is driven by causal effects rather than sorting by looking at families that move across areas using quasi-experimental methods, as well as a pure randomized experiment, the widely studied moving to opportunity experiment, where we show that moving to a low-poverty census tract at a young age raises your earnings in adulthood by about 30%. So there's these really substantial neighborhood causal effects on kids' long-term outcomes, particularly kids in low-income families. So that's the first fact. The second fact that we find is that if you move adults across areas, you end up finding essentially no impact on their earnings. So we find this pattern where if you move to a better area at a younger age as a child, you experience substantial gains. But if you move as an adult, we find giving somebody a housing voucher to move to a better neighborhood has essentially no impact on the adult's earnings. The third fact, which is what motivates the behavioral issues that I want to talk about here, is that many neighborhoods appear to offer better outcomes for children without significantly higher house prices or rents. So you might have thought, from an economist perspective, okay, maybe all of this is just priced. You have to pay a lot more to live in these lighter colored areas, and that's why these differences are persisting in equilibrium. Now, it turns out, though, when you correlate this variation with rents, there certainly is a positive correlation. It's absolutely true that places that generate better outcomes are more expensive on average. But that correlation is quite small. It's only around 0.2 overall. And so that basically is telling you that there are lots of places within a given metro area where you can move to another area where your kids would do much better, you don't earn any less as an adult, and it's not going to cost you more in terms of rents or house prices. Okay, so that naturally leads to the question, why don't families move to areas where their children would do much better? So the neoclassical model can explain that pattern. It would say that there's potentially utility from other amenities. There are many other things that enter into neighborhood choice besides how well your kids do. You might want to live closer to work, live near your friends, etc. There are many other things that could matter. Or another potential explanation is that you don't care that much about your kids. You place relatively low weight on your children's long-term outcomes. And so this just doesn't enter your utility as a decision maker, as a parent. So those are two, I think, somewhat plausible possibilities. Behavioral economics would, I think, suggest a different set of explanations, a different set of models. So one set of issues is that people might have status quo or present bias. So you have to recognize here that the gains for kids that we're documenting are realized when they become adults. So you have to wait 10 or 20 years to see the gains from your investment of moving to this different neighborhood. But of course, you have to pay the costs of relocating entirely upfront, not just the monetary cost of moving, but the psychological cost of having to re-optimize and move to a very different location, and so on. So anytime you have that situation where the payoffs are coming 20 years later and the costs are being borne up front, you worry that if people are present biased or they've got a status quo bias, they might tend towards staying in the worst neighborhood, even though it's going to have a downstream payoff that's substantial. Second, there's recent work which suggests that particularly for people living in high poverty, high stress areas, discount factors appear to be much lower. That is, people are putting much more weight on the present. And the logic here is basically, while one might think about planning for the long run in a very calm way, if you are in a stable environment, in a lot of the places we're talking about here, for instance, in the Moving to Opportunity experiment, 50% of the people living in those areas had been victimized by a gun or a knife, some crime within the past 2 years. Okay, so these are really high violence, high stress, high poverty areas. And I think there's evidence that people might not optimize perfectly, especially when it comes to long-term decisions when they're in such an environment. Third, come back to some of the informational issues we talked about in the previous part of this talk, where people just might not be perfectly informed that Cambridge or Somerville generates better outcomes for kids than parts of Boston. That we see that in the data now, it's not maybe perfectly evident on the ground. So the policy question, I think, is whether we should actually be trying to encourage low-income families to move to lower poverty areas. The behavioral model suggests that moving families to lower poverty areas might improve their welfare. So for example, in the US, we spend about $30 billion a year on housing vouchers to help families afford housing in better areas. And so the behavioral model would suggest that such subsidies or nudges, kind of counseling people to move to better areas, to encourage such moves, might improve their own private welfare because they were essentially underweighting the gains for their kids. They might have been making a mistake before. The neoclassical model makes strongly the opposite prediction, right? It says people are optimizing in their choice of neighborhoods. They have some reason to prefer living in the city of Boston than across the river. Why should the government come in and distort that decision? Unless, of course, there are externalities. And those externalities could potentially include intergenerational externalities if parents, for instance, underinvest in their children relative to the weight that the social planner would put on kids. I'm essentially going to argue that the behavioral models look very much like the neoclassical model with these externalities. So I'm not going to draw a sharp distinction there. But if you just think about private welfare, the neoclassical and behavioral models make very different predictions. So the question I want to talk about and conclude with here is how do we determine optimal policy if we allow for the possibility that there might be behavioral biases? So we're not totally sure. I would say given existing evidence, I don't know if people are choosing neighborhoods optimally or if some of these behavioral factors are at play. And so the question is how do we proceed with optimal policy in that context? So the fundamental problem is that social welfare, once we allow for these behavioral possibilities, depends upon experienced utility, which differs from individuals' decision utility. So that is, the utility function that people are using to make the choice of where to live might not be the same as utility function that actually governs their private welfare. And that creates a serious problem because we can no longer use revealed preference in order to identify experienced utility, which is, of course, the cornerstone of much of what we do in public finance. And so that, I think, makes many people uncomfortable with behavioral economics as applied to normative public economics because it suggests that essentially you have to take the stance that the policymaker knows better what's good for an individual than the individual himself. But what I'm going to argue is that it's perhaps feasible to still make progress in a non-paternalistic manner, essentially following the methods that have been used in the literature on externalities, which has a lot of parallels with the issues that arise in behavioral models, because essentially when you have an externality, one person's behavior is having an effect on social welfare that's not being fully captured in his utility function through revealed preference. And so there are a series of papers now that I essentially interpret as tackling this problem in ways that parallel the traditional literature on externalities. So to illustrate those methods, let me just give a simple depiction of the problem. So think about demand for a product and think about two different demand curves. You've got your observed demand curve, which is the demand curve that you just estimate in the data as the econometrician. That's just an empirical statistical object. And then there's your willingness to pay for the good. So of course, in the standard model, the red and the blue curves are the same thing. That's the idea of using revealed preference. The schedule of marginal utilities coincides with observed demand. In a behavioral model, we allow for the possibility that these two things might be different. In the context of the example that I was giving you, people might underinvest in the quality of the neighborhood they live in. So the observed demand is essentially too low relative to their true willingness to pay. And as a result, you have lost surplus. You essentially have a deadweight cost from underconsumption that is exactly analogous to the deadweight loss from an externality, right? It's essentially like you're imposing an externality on yourself by choosing to consume C0 units instead of C star. So with that setup, the question we want to ask is, how can we identify this blue curve when agents do not optimize? That's the fundamental challenge. And let me talk about three ways that people have taken, three approaches people have taken in literature to do that. So the first is just to measure utility directly. So this is analogous to the contingent valuation literature on externalities, where we try to directly evaluate what people are willing to pay to have different outcomes. And so there's a lot of work, as you know, that directly tries to essentially elicit people's marginal utilities from self-reported measures of happiness. And there are a number of issues that arise in terms of the reliability of those measures. And Danny Kahneman, Alan Kruger, Doug Bernheim, and others have been trying to develop refined methods of correcting for the biases that arise when you ask people to reveal their happiness. And so that's one approach where there's a lot of work being done. Potentially quite a bit of progress can be made. The challenge here is that this is not directly based on choices, which is traditionally what we like to use in economics to gauge what people are really willing to do. But I think the benefit is that there's a great deal of versatility in terms of being able to potentially directly measure people's willingness to pay in lots of contexts. So I think that's one promising approach. A second approach is to use revealed preference in an environment where agents optimize. So this is an idea that Bernheim and Rangel formalize, and I think of this as kind of analogous to the sufficient statistic approach that's popular in public economics. And so let me give you an example of how this would work. So suppose you have a clear sense of why people are deviating from optimizing behavior. So one example that we've thought about is issues of tax salience. That is, people don't pay full attention to the taxes that they face. So you might think about trying to estimate the demand curve when the taxes that people face are salient to them. So one way in which you can try to manipulate that, which Mike mentioned this experiment in his introduction, we did an experiment at a grocery store where we literally showed people the tax-inclusive price of the goods that they were buying. So for example, in the state of California, when you buy this hairbrush, you'd normally pay you'd see a price of $5.79 on the shelf, but in fact, when you go to pay for the item at the register, they'd add California sales tax and the total price would be $6.22. So we just made the tax-inclusive price clear to the customers. Now you might wonder, by the way, why is this experiment being done on this weird set of products like hairbrushes and cosmetic accessories? So when we first approached the manager to ask him if he'd be willing to collaborate with us on this experiment, said, it's a really important policy question and so on. He said, that's all great, but I believe your hypothesis, and we're going to lose way too much money if we do this and all the products in the store. So I'm going to restrict you to this limited set of, cosmetics and other stuff. So that was good enough for our purposes. But anyway, so essentially the idea here is that if we elicit the demand curve when people are seeing the full price, and then we see the demand curve in red when people are not paying attention to taxes, we can then go about computing the deadweight loss or the inefficiency from the degree of misoptimization in a way that doesn't require us to just exogenously say, I know you should be buying this much of the good. This is, I think, a more disciplined way to proceed. The third approach is what I'll call structural modeling. So this is just to specify and estimate a particular behavioral model. So suppose you are willing to assume, or you have some evidence for the idea that people have particular preferences. So for instance, beta delta hyperbolic discounting preferences. So if you're willing to assume that structure, then you can go out and use variation in the timing of payoffs or various other sources of variation to just directly estimate beta and delta. You can then make the assumption that behavior, people make choices when beta is less than 1, but their true willingness to pay is identified by the case when beta equals 1 and they're exponential discounters. And if I've estimated beta and delta, I can proceed in a perfectly rigorous way to figure out what the optimal policy will be. Again, in a data-driven manner, not just imposing my views paternalistically on what optimal policy should be. So all of these, I would say there's a lot of work remaining to be done. There are people in this room working on these problems. But I think they illustrate that one can potentially make constructive progress in even the challenging issue of welfare analysis. Let me end by making one final point. So I think in many applications, we might be uncertain about the positive model given current evidence. So for instance, as I was just saying, both the neoclassical and behavioral models can fit the 3 facts about neighborhood effects that I described. When you are uncertain about what the true model of behavior is, I think there's a tendency among economists to use the neoclassical model as the default. So that I think a lot of us think, well, if I'm not totally sure that there are behavioral phenomena at play, then I'm just going to go with the approach of using the neoclassical model. I'd argue a more principled approach, which goes back to traditions in economics, is to explicitly account for model uncertainty, as in the literature on robust control in macroeconomics. So let me give you a simple example of how this might work. So think about a 2-state example. Let's say families either optimize when choosing neighborhoods, so either they behave rationally, or they are biased towards staying in worse areas for the various reasons that I was describing, like status quo bias and so on. Let's further make the following assumption, which I think might seem plausible, which is that optimizers are insensitive to nudges such as framing. So if you try to give people counseling when you give them a housing voucher and frame some neighborhoods as being better than others, let's make the assumption that if the agent is a neoclassical optimizer, he knows perfectly well what's good for him and he's going to disregard your advice. But behavioral agents, those who are making mistakes and are not quite sure what to do, they, let's say, are influenced by these frames, they're influenced by the nudge. In this simple setup here, the optimal policy is to follow the behavioral model and nudge agents toward moving to better, for instance, lower poverty areas, right? And so what's the logic? It's very simple. If it turns out that you're in the optimizing state of the world, there's no loss in using the nudge. You might as well, having the nudge there is not going to do anything because the optimizers will figure it out. And if you're in the state of the world where it turns out people are actually making these mistakes, then the nudge pays off and you end up potentially increasing welfare. So what this simple example illustrates is that model uncertainty can actually be a justification, I think, for using behaviorally motivated tools like nudges. And moreover, it illustrates that the neoclassical model should not necessarily be given priority just because we're uncertain about what the true model of behavior is. So let me conclude. So the central message that I want to convey here is that I think it makes sense for us as practitioners of economics, not as pure behavioral economists, the decision to include behavioral factors as a pragmatic rather than philosophical choice. Behavioral factors might be critical in some applications, and they might be safely ignored in others. In my view, this is just like deciding whether we should assume a quasi-linear utility function or a time-separable utility function for a given application. And I think dividing the field into behavioral economists and neoclassical economists is sort of akin to distinguishing the time-separable economists from the other economists, which I think we all would agree is probably not a very productive route. This pragmatic approach, why should we take such a pragmatic approach? I think it follows very naturally from widely accepted methodological traditions in our profession, dating back to Friedman and many others. But more importantly, I think it can help us answer critical policy questions from childhood to retirement. Thank you.